So like as was mentioned, we're here to talk about civil asset forfeiture. I'd actually like to take it back a little further, if I can. Civil asset forfeiture as a actual common law practice, if we want to go back far enough, actually has its roots in the Roman Empire, when basically, when human, mostly people that were part of some of the Gaelic conquests, were basically brought into the Roman Empire. If these slaves were to cause damage to another person's property, or maybe even kill another slave, they were basically used as commodities and traded in among themselves. Fast forward that to that Knoxville surrender to what we had more recently, both in the Navigation Acts and how it kind of promulgated from a legal backwater to the practice that we have today. So, talk a little bit about myself. If you ask my wife, she said it's the only part I'm good at talking about. I am Derek Cohen. I'm a policy analyst at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. I'm finishing up my PhD in criminology. Most of my focus is on statistics. I've written, I wouldn't say extensively, but more than most non-policing scholars on certain aspects of policing. You'll see up here I have a work both in the Encyclopedia of Theoretical Criminology and in the Oxford Handbook of Police and Policing. These are both fairly highly regarded sources in academia, and the topics I wrote about in each are not necessarily ones that are typically written about from a conservative academic. Well, then again, a conservative academic's not very typical to begin with, I guess I should say.
You're not a socialist?
No, just mostly. Which still makes me more conservative than most. I kid. So with that, I wrote in the Oxford Handbook on Police and Policing about race and racial profiling and how that affects policing. Now, this was part of a larger section about policing certain populations. It was a very interesting editing process, especially when you're dealing with people. I mean, the editors were great. Michael Reisig and Dr. Kane were great on this. The issue is, we had to bring along so much research that was of such paltry scientific value. And that's what we kind of see when we're facing what we're looking at with civil asset forfeiture. So much of the research that's done on it, and this is not a slight of the people for Institute for Justice, but so much of the research that's been done on it, the stuff that's from Donald Boudreaux from GMU, the stuff that is mostly adorns law reviews, it doesn't actually have much of a statistical emphasis. Now, one of the places I'd like to take this further in the future is to actually deal with some of this stuff from a more empirical standpoint. So really quick, before I jump into this, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about the Texas Public Policy Foundation. We are a nonprofit research organization. We are a C3, which means that we don't do any sort of lobbying, any sort of scorecards, or any sort of electioneering in any way. We saved that for our friends at the ACLU. I'm just kidding. I'll have a lot of jokes fall flat tonight, so just so everybody here understands. I assume being a kind of a hot topic du jour, everybody understands the basic premise of civil asset forfeiture, right? And again, I'm going to give a brief primer, but I'm going to go more into some of the issues around the edges. Let's think of how a forfeiture proceeding might go. And that was a great prompt by Michael there. If we have a legal police stop, that police, under the suspicion of a crime, can seize your property. Even in criminal cases, that's the way it is. That is if we have a reasonable suspicion, if the police have a reasonable suspicion, you can have your property seized, either for its evidentiary value in the pending criminal case, or simply because it's within the bounds of the state's power leading up to a criminal case. However, as we've seen both in the horror stories and in even statutorily empowered, sometimes these charges never come. Sometimes we have instances where individuals will be waylaid on the way to buy a significant sum of property. They'll be waylaid with money to buy an additional car when they get to their destination. Whichever the case may be, they could have several $1,000s on them. Now, I think in today's paperless society, I think there's a false belief that carrying around several $1,000s in paper money is somehow indicative of criminal behavior. Obviously, you know, by the strict standard of the law, it's nowhere near that way, or they'd actually have, they'd actually bring criminal charges. So it's this kind of gray area between legal police stop and I would say 99.9 out of 100 police stops are legal, clearing the low burden of proof that one has to have to actually make the stop. And then we get into the issues of civil asset forfeiture, which I think anyone here would understand is clearly not as forthright. So let's talk about a couple additional issues around the edges of forfeiture. So CAFRA. CAFRA was the first and only civil asset forfeiture reform effort that we had in the federal Congress. Now, unfortunately with CAFRA, it wasn't, you know, with all due respect to the representative who took 7 years to get this through, it was not that strong to begin with, and it quickly had its teeth kicked out. The innocent owner defense lasted maybe a year and a half. However, we have basically walked back from there. That was the first speed bump in the escalation of this practice, and then it just resumed right after that. The burden of proof is the big thing that we're going to talk about here tonight, and we're going to talk about it as we go into the legislation about this. The burden of proof is simply what threshold, what standard of sufficiency must the state meet before they can actually take your property for good and liquidate it or put it to their own uses. Since this is commonly a civil standard, and obviously it's a civil standard here because that's what we're talking about, civil asset forfeiture. Since it's a civil standard, we don't have beyond a reasonable doubt. We don't have reasonable suspicion. We have civil standards like preponderance of the evidence, clear and convincing evidence, and both of which have a rather amorphous legal construct surrounding them. A default judgment is when you fail to show up to defend your ownership interest in that property. Now, let's say, again, to use a fairly horrific story, let's say that I'm a police officer, I seize your car, and well, now here's your court date, you've been notified, how come you haven't showed up? Or how come you haven't shown up? Well, because I have your car, or at least we do an impound. So the default judgment tends to be the modal cause of getting property, I would say, cleared of adjudication in civil asset forfeiture. With equitable sharing, a lot of people are thinking that equitable sharing is now a thing of the past with Attorney General Eric Holder's proclamation. Well, if you can take Eric Holder's word at something, go right ahead. But equitable sharing, especially even the way it's outlined in the announcement from the Department of Justice, is not sufficiently walked back. It only prohibits a certain type of equitable sharing. And let's keep in mind, we are halfway through the confirmation process of a new Attorney General who calls equitable sharing and civil asset forfeiture writ large a invaluable tool. So all we need to do is replace the actual Attorney General or the administration, and that could all get us back to square one.
Invaluable to whom?
I'm sorry?
Invaluable to whom? Because it's not our benefit, right?
Certainly, no. It would be invaluable to the law enforcement
revenue
agencies.
model of the state, or?
Again, I would never say that. This is a little farther on in the presentation. I don't like the policing for profit because it almost suggests that it is something where if you modeled it out, a certain amount of inputs would basically lead ad infinitum to an upward slope. I don't think it's policing for profit per se. I do think there are corrupt incentives though, and I think the corrupt incentives are what need to be controlled. And I think that we can actually cut into that fairly well. And here's my favorite part of the presentation when we actually talk about civil asset forfeiture in Texas. Here's a little known fact about civil asset forfeiture in Texas. It does not exist. We do not have civil asset forfeiture in Texas. What we do have is we have in the Code of Criminal Procedure, we have the ability for the state to take your property, meet a civil threshold to keep it, but we don't actually have civil asset forfeiture. I guarantee that when we start having hearings on this and on the bills that we have, you are going to hear people say, oh, we don't even have civil asset forfeiture. And Matt's nodding because he knows exactly who's going to make this argument. It's not going to be you, right?
I'll take my talking points.
Okay, fair enough. So if you look at how we actually get here, like I said, the Code of Criminal Procedure, Chapter 59, is what actually regulates any sort of forfeiture of contraband. Now, keep in mind, contraband writ large is what actually is the fruits of or tool used in connection with any sort of criminal activity. And you'll start seeing some of the nibbling around the edges on that when we start talking about the bills. Who benefits from this? The law enforcement agency. And the law enforcement agencies is oftentimes seen synonymous with police, and that's not correct. Because police, sheriffs, game wardens are huge, which we'll talk about that when we start talking about the bills that do or do not affect the Parks and Wildlife Code. And then taking about a third of all forfeiture proceeds are the district attorneys as well. So what is actually mandated by our civil asset forfeiture laws? Well, if contested, keep in mind, if there is not going to be a default judgment, if you actually show up to court to protest, or should I say, to actually defend your property rights, if you actually have the temerity to show up to court and defend your property rights, the state must meet a preponderance of the evidence standard. Now, how many actual lawyers do we have in here? Okay, an educated crowd, good. No, just for the record, nobody raised their hand. So, preponderance of the evidence, I used to teach criminal procedure at the college level. One thing I would get yelled at from my legal friends is they would say you can't assign, an arbitrary percentage to a particular legal standard. And of course I say, well, forget it, it's my lecture, I'll say whatever I want. So you can't do that here in civil, though, simply because it tends to resist it. We want to say beyond a reasonable doubt is you're 95% sure. A reasonable suspicion is, 33, and then you want to say probable cause is usually around 51. Again, these are arbitrary standards, but when we talk about preponderance of the evidence, that generally means if we are going to take a long eye at all of the evidence, and we generally can say, this property, I guess, it probably could have came from some sort of illicit activity. Again, if that's the bulwark upon which your property rights are based, we're off to a pretty bad start as it is. All agencies with forfeiture accounts must report. So this mandate also concludes a report that must go to the Attorney General's office. Now everyone here, I assume, has read the Attorney General's report on this, right? You haven't because it doesn't exist. Yeah, it doesn't exist yet. So let's just talk one by one about some of the legislation that's already been filed. And I do need to reiterate, as part of a C3 organization, I do not take any stance on these bills, but these are just what's contained therein. So the first bill that we have is HB 248, filed by Jeff Leach. This elevates the burden of proof from preponderance to clear and convincing. In other words, it goes where it clearly says the state must meet the threshold of preponderance of the evidence. It says now we must meet clear and convincing evidence. So if we're going to take the easy way out and look at preponderance of the evidence at 33%, I usually say this is 66%, and then all my lawyer friends again flip out and say that's a ridiculous way of looking at it, but hey. I also refer to myself as a 0L in law school, so I'm working on it. So with that, it just raises the threshold, and it deliberately does not address the Parks and Wildlife Code. I actually stay out of listing this for every other bill from here on, unless it says it addresses Parks and Wildlife. Let's just assume that it doesn't. We also have HB 249, also filed by Jeff Leach, and this is basically mandates a case-based granular reporting system. In other words, instead of in Chapter 59, where we have to report to the Attorney General's office, this actually says you need to report the specific items and the specific disposition of the case. So that's that really expands some of the reporting provisions. Boris Miles has filed HB 259, which improves notification proceedings, and it also stems some of the ability of the state to take property pursuant to an allegation of littering. Now that's a pretty onerous usage there. I actually was trying to find a good example of somebody losing their car because they threw a cigarette butt out the window, which is kind of how I read this statute. Luckily, we have not had any of that yet, but again, if we have a forthright provision to try to prevent that from happening, that would be what we see here. Phil Stevenson filed HB 472. HB 472 mandates, again, the granular case-based reporting, and it also permits that forfeiture funds be spent on preparing the report. It allows law enforcement agencies, if they were going to hire an outside auditor, if they were going to hire a grad student or something, some other form of cheap and reduced labor, they would be able to do this.
So can you
Yeah, sure.
elucidate the granular reporting? I don't know what that means.
So right now, the form that they turn in is a 6-page form, and it simply is broken out into totals by the specific, I guess, type of forfeiture, and it's aggregated up. So here's all the drug seizures, here's all the vehicle seizures, here's all the weapon seizures. Granular, at least granular and case-based, would simply mean that there would be an entry for every case, along with an intended value. So you'd be able to see, well, and with the disposition of the case, you'd be like, this was civilly forfeited, this was a default judgment, this we pinched a guy moving, a bushel of cocaine across the border, so, we can throw that out of the calculation. Here we have another civil forfeiture. It's really going to get into how much of these forfeiture accounts, and these forfeiture accounts are massive. I'm pursuant to an open records request, I got all the, basically FY13 back through 9 for some particular localities, and there in FY12 alone, there was $150 million in forfeiture accounts. So I mean, this is just what is in the accounts at year end. Yes?
So those bills don't actually help people from getting their stuff taken in the first place. It just makes it more clear why they had it confiscated in the reporting afterwards?
That is correct on the reporting bills. The burden of proof bills, however, they would make it much harder for the state to make the seizure.
The number you just mentioned, is that Texas alone or is that nationwide?
That's Texas alone. That's Texas alone, and it doesn't include any equitable sharing. Well, I guess, let me couch that. It could include equitable sharing remissions from the prior year.
Derek, will you explain to them what equitable sharing is?
Oh, my mistake. I glossed right over that. So equitable sharing is simply, I describe it in a white paper I did in March as basically a 21st century version of the silver platter doctrine. Anyone who's steeped in Fourth Amendment jurisprudence is familiar with the way that you have two parallel jurisdictions. You have the state jurisdiction, you have the federal jurisdiction. The state jurisdiction is preempted in some cases by the federal jurisdiction. However, the states can also regulate what is seized pursuant to their legal jurisdiction. So, let's say that the state of Texas really wants to make it hard for certain seizures to happen. They would go ahead and pass a law X, Y, and Z that basically says, you can't take people's property unless you've already found them guilty in a court of law. Well, obviously there'd be evidentiary problems with that, but again, we're not going to get into that. However, they could say, the federal standard is much lower. The federal standard is only, again, just using the hypothetical, still at preponderance of the evidence. Let's allow the federal government to make the seizure. Because we're working with these nice guys from the DEA over here. Let's allow them to make the seizure. And then we are going to actually get a cut of that property once it's adjudicated to that standard, and then it's going to be remitted, usually to the tune of about 80% to the actual local actors. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to gloss over equitable sharing there so much. I didn't want to go too far ahead. The Hernandez bill, it permits the forfeiture funds, and this would be outside the legitimate law enforcement purposes. This permits funds to be used for the children of slain police officers. And then at the end of the bill, it also compels a yearly report that must be put on the website. Longoria's bills, HB 713, has to do with seizures made in case of prostitution. This would be an individual, John's car being taken. And then on the Senate side, and with its House analog right here, SB 95 and HB 1012, we see that this both elevates the burden of proof to clear and convincing evidence, but does not address reporting or the wildlife code there. So we do actually have both here. These are identical bills. This one is a little shorter, but has the same thrust, I would say. But with that, so we have a bill in the House and in the Senate that actually would raise that burden of proof. So that's just the quick overview. I think that kept it within the allotment that you kind of want me like jurisdictionally go into. I'll talk a little bit about police militarization. Yes, please.
To make sure that I followed, there are no bills filed that would require a conviction before, or would require the police to return property if there was no conviction?
No,
Okay.
not at all.
And based on what you described earlier, even if there were a bill requiring conviction, they could defer that forfeiture to a federal law enforcement agency and then share the spoils afterwards.
And that's actually what, I mean, that's actually the thrust I'm seeing at the federal level with both Wahlberg and, Wahlberg in the House and Paul in the Senate. If you look at the, well, it was originally introduced in the Fair Act, as the Fair Act, and then Wahlberg amended his forfeiture reform package to include a House copy of that. That's what that's trying to preempt, is basically to end that end around. Because that's the thing, I mean, if you even look at North Carolina, a state with some, well, what at least had some pretty robust forfeiture protections, you just see equitable sharing go through the roof when that happens. Because that simply says, well, the contraband, air quotes, is still there. How are we gonna get it? Again, that's a cynical reading, but there is empirical support to that. If we look at the work that was done by Williams, Holcomb, and Kovanzik, we actually see that, and that was 2010, I believe. So,
Hey, Derek,
yeah.
Can I throw you a little curveball right now?
Sure.
I was gonna see if we could get Matt on the same topic since we're kind of focused on it.
Sure.
And then we'll swing you back into talk. He's gonna talk a little bit about broader police-military relations, because I see this as a result of a larger structural problem that we have, and he was gonna expand on some other issues that we're facing because of the bad structure, or the flaws in the structure. And if you don't mind,